This is a CBC podcast.
Danse Anine Boujou. Hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. The true crime genre is booming. After all, who doesn't love a good whodunit? Today on Unreserved, we're moving beyond the mystery and talking about how true crime can be used to tell bigger stories, asking what ethics are at play, and discovering what happens when trauma becomes entertainment.
A million questions: why, how, who, what.
A country police investigation, overshadowed by the politics of race.
You know how it is. Young Aboriginal men, they just walk away, lie down on railway tracks and wait to get hit by a freight train. That's actually their answer.
That was their story, you know what I mean? But it wasn't our story.
That was a bit from Unravel, a true crime podcast from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The first season is called Blood on the Tracks, and it's hosted by award-winning journalist Alan Clark. Alan is Muhurari, and the podcast follows him as he investigates the unsolved death of an Indigenous teen named Mark Haynes. Alan joins me from France. Hello, Alan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's begin by having you tell us, who was Mark Haynes?
So Mark was a 17-year-old Gomeroi teenager. That's an Aboriginal tribe in far north New South Wales, which is a state of Australia. And in 1988, his body was found on train tracks just outside of his town. And immediately from that moment, his family thought there was foul play involved. However, getting the police to kind of believe that Mark had actually been the victim of foul play was very difficult for them. At the time, there was a lot of institutionalized racism. There was a lot of other issues within the town. So no one really in the wider community cared about his death apart from his family. And so I met the family 6 years ago, and they were telling me about this case, and I thought, oh, well, this sounds really interesting. It's something I'd like to look at. And then I've spent the last 6 years investigating Mark's death, essentially.
Wow.
And started to see very, very clearly that there was essentially a miscarriage of justice. I could also see that even the most basic kind of police investigation was not afforded to Mark. And so that was my starting point. And I went back to the family and basically said, well, look, I'm happy to help you with this, and I'll be in it for the long haul with you.
Mm-hmm. And what was different about this case than other cases?
So I guess in terms of Mark's case, he was just not worthy of the police's time or the media's time, as opposed to other young white teenagers who had died in similar circumstances. You know, their cases elicited a lot of public empathy, a lot of police work to try and figure out what had happened to them. So for me, I wanted to take Mark's case and basically use that as a way to try to get proof that that racism does play a role in these unsolved Aboriginal homicides.
Was it a surprise to you to find out that Mark's death was what you might call typical in a murder investigation of an Aboriginal person?
Look, it wasn't a surprise. I'm Aboriginal myself, Murruwarri. I think why I was attracted to Mark's case, in the sense of wanting to try and get some justice there, was that I'd grown up in a very small town, very similar to Mark. In fact, we have tribal group affiliation. So on one side of my family is Gomeroi, Mark was Gomeroi, so we share some of the same land. The relationship between my community and the local police was very acrimonious. We were brought up to fear police. We had family members who had died in police custody. We had family members who had been murdered, and no one had ever done anything about it. So when I had met Mark's family, it felt like my family in a sense. It felt like my community. So that's what kind of drew me to it. So I was not surprised at all when I looked through the documents and found that the police had barely done anything. Police lost evidence. They didn't canvass crime scenes. They didn't interview witnesses, even though there was a lot of evidence at the time that just sort of went untouched.
What are you hoping sharing Mark's story as a true crime story will do in the bigger picture?
Part of the issue was also, how do we frame this story? How do we get people interested and thinking, well, what if that was my son? And basically to do that was true crime, essentially, was taking what is very much a story about racism, injustice, all of the big issues that people might be turned off by, and actually, kind of packaging it in almost in a true crime narrative, being able to explore those issues without, having people kind of turn away from it.
Now, your reporting has had a big impact on Mark's case. In fact, it caused his investigation to be reopened. But I want to ask about the impact this case has had on you personally. Let's hear a clip from the podcast.
It's around 7:30 p.m. and I'm lying on my hotel bed in Tamworth and I'm absolutely shattered. I didn't count on how emotional I would feel, and I don't like talking about the emotional toll that it takes on me sometimes, because it's not my pain to have. I'm here for the family, to give them a platform, and sometimes I become part of the family, and then sometimes I am the journalist. It's very hard to go between the two sometimes, but I'm incredibly privileged and honoured to be able to share their story.
Now, of course, we know that journalists are supposed to be hard and unbiased and all of these things that keeps them at a distance from the stories that we do. But what impact has it had on you personally?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's had an enormous emotional toll on me, and it's something I didn't deal with actually until about a year ago. And actually, when that clip you just played, I think I didn't think about it too much after that. And then it was at the end of last year that I started to feel, I don't know, it very emotional about it in a way that I hadn't before. Because I'd suppressed a lot of that. See, that notion of journalists, as you just said, being very hard, being detached from the story, don't get too close to your talent in a sense. So a lot of that was, kind of in my head. But at the same time, like I said, I was part of Mark's family. I'm an Aboriginal boy. I called them uncle and auntie family. I was welcomed in. It can be very hard being an Aboriginal reporter when you're in that situation.
Certainly.
So, for a long time I just focused on the goal. And like I said, I did not want to be selfish about this. Like, it's, this isn't my loss. This isn't my tragedy. I was very careful about trying not to report how I'd felt through the whole process. But, and so when the podcast came out, I did cop a lot of flack from a lot of people, particularly journalists, who were interviewing me about it and asking me constantly about that, the idea of advocacy journalism, as if it was some kind of dirty word. And I just had to clearly say to them, well, how can the advocacy be wrong if there's clearly a miscarriage of justice here? And I've got proof of it. I have evidence of it. Of course, I'm allowed to be angry about this. I'm allowed to be passionate about this. Like, this is what good investigative journalists do. And also the double standard that I'm an Aboriginal journalist and that I have colleagues who are non-Indigenous, who are investigative journalists who talk constantly about their connections to victims' families or communities, and yet they're very rarely questioned on that. And so there was a lot of things at play.
Certainly. Why continue then? Why continue to do this work? Why is it important?
I could not see myself doing anything else. It's just so important. I think from a very young age, all I wanted to do was address injustice, In fact, one of my clearest memories is a newspaper, one of our national newspapers, having my hometown on the front cover, calling it the most dangerous place in the world because of young Aboriginal people and the high crime rate. And I remember just being absolutely sort of shocked by that, and also very it sparked something in me because I couldn't reconcile that image in the media with the one in my actual community. So for me, I'm just driven. I just have something inside of me that just wants to give voice to the community and actually validate their concerns and actually get some real world impact with those stories. So yeah, I really couldn't see myself doing any other work.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it, Alan. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alan Clark is an award-winning Muhuari journalist and the host of the ABC podcast Blood on the Tracks. Mark Haynes' death remains unsolved, and the case is still open. If you want to hear more from his podcast, we've got a link to it on our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Still ahead on the show, can the true crime genre be used for something other than entertainment?
There's no denying that true crime is just exploding right now, and true crime podcasting in particular. And so there just seems to be this insatiable appetite from the audience perspective for these kinds of stories. I like to say that we try to subvert the popularity of the true crime genre to really tell a story about history and to tell a story about Indigenous lives in Canada.
Cree journalist Connie Walker shares how she tells the stories of our missing and murdered. That's in just a few minutes. On August 7th, 1994, a man had a psychotic episode and stabbed 7 people in a cafe in Connecticut. Bruce Shapiro, an editor for The Nation, found himself on the other end of the story that night. He was one of those critically injured in the attack. The impact of reporting on trauma became the focus of Bruce's work. Today, Bruce Shapiro is the director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at the Columbia Journalism School. He joins me from New York. Bruce, welcome to the show.
I am very glad to be here.
You were used to covering crime stories as a reporter. What was it like being reported on as a victim?
Well, it was certainly startling. I mean, up until that point, I had spent 15 years as a journalist covering everything from local criminal justice to the death penalty, prisons, police abuses around the U.S. and other human rights stories, and thought I understood the experiences of victims, survivors pretty well. And the truth was, I didn't know a thing. First of all, on a kind of personal level, what it's like to cope with physical injury inflicted by another human being, and what it's like to cope with the psychological aftermath of that were very new to me. But it was also a strange thing to go from being the reporter covering crime to being reported on, and to experience both pretty terrible and also pretty good approaches by various journalists. It was really, in a sense, humbling to realize how little I had thought about how to approach people who'd been through the most harrowing of experiences and how to tell these difficult stories.
Mm-hmm. How well do you think the media industry has done in preparing journalists for their work when it comes to stories that have to do with trauma?
Historically, really badly. I think, though, if you go back in the history of journalism, there are plenty of examples through history of reporters who have had really innovative, sensitive, effective approaches to writing about trauma. But really, I would say that in the last 15 years, we have seen a lot of progress. There's been a tremendously innovative generation of reporters in the U.S., in Canada, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, who have pioneered methodologies for reporting on, for example, survivors of institutional sex abuse, clerical sex abuse, women who have been subjected to harassment or assault, indigenous communities. There is a tremendous amount of interesting journalism that is being done now using kind of techniques pioneered over the last 20 years. Many listeners are probably familiar with the film Spotlight that came out a few years ago about the Boston Globe's famous 2001 investigation of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. At that time, there were really only a handful of reporters anywhere in North America or anywhere in the world who had had any experience reporting on these kinds of abuses, or even who thought that it was part of the news agenda. And if you watch that movie, you can see them having to create techniques. You watch them struggle with interviewing survivors about events that happened decades ago. All of this stuff, which then leads to the great Pulitzer Prize-winning story, a story that has changed the world. Well, not only did that story change the world, but it changed journalism. If you fast forward a few years, from 2001 to now 2 years ago, we saw investigative journalists at the New York Times and Ronan Farrow at the New Yorker break the Harvey Weinstein story and launch the global Me Too movement. That was a triumph of investigative journalism. It was a triumph that built on the previous work that 20 years ago those reporters at the Boston Globe did. All the work that the Times and New Yorker reporters put into interviewing survivors, getting around non-disclosure agreements, documenting patterns of behavior, that was an example of innovative trauma reporting that built on the innovations of recent years. So, I don't like to use the word golden age, but I think we are actually in a period of great innovation in redefining whose stories are worth telling, which abuses are worth covering, and what kinds of techniques we use to report on them.
How do you approach trauma in journalism when you're teaching that to new folks coming up?
Well, that's a really good question, and there are a number of people doing very creative work, a number of journalism professors and senior journalists in the field who are mentoring young colleagues in covering trauma, on ethics, everything that we teach to young journalists here at Columbia Journalism School, for example, needs some trauma awareness. I mean, the first story I ever covered as a young reporter in 1978 involved the very untimely death of a 28-year-old woman in my neighborhood in Chicago who died in a carbon monoxide accident, a gas leak in her apartment building, which was not maintained properly. Her name was Sandra Robinson, and her death was a homicide. I didn't think of that as anything other than, okay, I got a story I got to cover. No one ever said to me, here's how you interview a family. Here's what's at stake for her friends and neighbors. Here's what the aftermath of an incident like that is going to look at. Yet young reporters all the time cover this sort of stuff. You wouldn't send a reporter to cover a baseball game who doesn't know what a home run is. We send reporters to knock on the doors of bereaved families or to interview migrants who have no experience, or to cover trials who have no sense.
We're talking about the true crime genre on our show today. When it comes to true crime and ethical storytelling, there are a number of elements at play: sensationalism, trauma as entertainment. What are you seeing as this type of storytelling evolves?
Well, first, let's stipulate that true crime has, back to the beginnings of daily newspapers in the 19th century, true crime has always been a big driver of middle-class news consumption. Okay, it attracts readers. It gets eyeballs. I'm seeing it go in a couple of directions. There's a lot of true crime now that is no different from the sort of the cable crime shows like Cops of 20 years ago that are simply designed to keep you watching because of the sensational nature of the crime involved or the fascination of the police procedural. Some of this is good stuff. A lot of it is sensational or doesn't really lead you anywhere. There are some folks, and I think the podcast Serial probably fits into this, who are taking the possibilities of long-form storytelling and using them to drill down more deeply into unsolved crimes, into miscarriages of justice. A place like the Marshall Project, a criminal justice reporting nonprofit based in New York, has done stuff on that. There are a number of those kinds of podcasts that are going with greater depth and taking advantage of the flexibility in time and the flexibility of format to broaden our understanding of these stories. Whether that trend holds, whether we continue to get deep reporting on crime survivors, on the roots of violence, on its impact on society, I don't know. We'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. So how then can an understanding of trauma impact how true crime stories are told?
Journalism historically has been pretty good at what you might think of as the act one of crime or war or injustice. We know when something bad happens how to go in, find out who the victims are, who did it, and if that's known, and you kind of put that news out there. What we don't do so well is either follow the arc of recovery for individuals and communities, the people who do well, the people who struggle, the fragmentation that sometimes happens in communities or the unity that people are sometimes capable of. That's using trauma not only as a kind of lens for being more compassionate and ethical to individuals, but changing the very idea of what counts as news and putting invisible victimization on a national agenda.
Bruce, thank you so much for your time today.
Very glad to be here.
Bruce Shapiro is the director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at the Columbia Journalism School. These days, true crime podcasts are everywhere. But there can be issues when telling traumatic stories, issues when these stories become entertainment. My next guest has thought a lot about not sacrificing ethics for storytelling. Connie Walker is an award-winning Cree journalist, and she's the host of CBC's true crime podcast, Missing and Murdered. Before we hear from Connie, let's take a listen to the trailer for the most recent season of Missing and Murdered.
To have your family member stolen, murdered, then missing?
Oh, wait a minute. This is Cleo.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. The government can get away with things if nobody knows what happens.
Yeah, I'm not sure that information is correct.
She was driven away and I went the other way. And I've been looking for her ever since. Promised I'd find her and eventually I will.
She tried her darndest to get back to Canada and see her family. She did everything within her power to get back there.
I cannot do this alone. Help us find her.
That's the trailer for Finding Cleo, the second season of CBC's award-winning true crime podcast, Missing and Murdered. Connie, welcome.
Hi, Rosanna. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. How did you come up with the idea for the podcast Missing and Murdered?
Well, it was really an evolution. I didn't set out to do a podcast, but it really kind of was born of what was years of work reporting on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's something that CBC News has taken on in the last several years. And we started out with a database where we tried to compile as many unsolved cases as we could, always with the attempt to kind of go beyond the statistics. There was so much emphasis on the number of missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls, and we really wanted our coverage to help tell a bigger story, to show how every single woman or girl has a family that loves and misses them and has a community. And in the beginning, our work was, for the news service. So we wrote online stories. We did some longer documentaries for the National. But I remember feeling that, even though the families were so grateful that this was an issue that was finally being taken seriously in the media and that they were getting an opportunity to talk about their loved ones, that it felt like we were missing important pieces of the context in some of these shorter stories. And so when the opportunity to do a podcast came up, we jumped at it. And I think that it really is the perfect kind of platform and format to tell stories about Indigenous issues, because the context is so important. And with the podcast, you really have the space to talk not only focus on the mystery of someone's death or disappearance, but to really help people understand how that's connected back to Canadian history and how that's connected back to the legacies of residential schools and colonization in Canada.
So what was it about the true crime genre that made it a better way to tell these stories?
I don't even think that was a deliberate thing for us at the beginning. We were actually actively trying not to focus on the violence that often resulted in the deaths or disappearances of women and girls. But when it came to the podcast, it actually, it became a tool for us. I like to say that we try to subvert the popularity of the true crime genre to really tell a story about history and to tell a story about the Indigenous lives in Canada. And Finding Cleo, for example, like if we had asked people to listen to a 7-hour documentary about Canadian history and about child welfare policies in the 1960s and how they're continuing to impact Indigenous communities today, there would definitely be people who would be interested in that. But I think that because true crime has become so popular, there's just kind of an insatiable appetite for this content right now, that we were able to attract a much bigger audience that didn't even know they were interested in Indigenous issues until they heard the podcast. So for me, true crime and the popularity of it is actually an opportunity to help tell people about these bigger stories.
You and your team are doing true crime storytelling in a different way, providing context, providing background, providing history. Are there ethical issues at play when you do something like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, in any story about Indigenous issues, I think that there are so many things that journalists need to be aware of when reporting in Indigenous communities. And the biggest one for me is the role of trauma. Obviously, as an Indigenous person who grew up in my community, something that I've been navigating my whole life. But really, I think I've just in the last few years really understood how important trauma-informed journalism is in the work that we're doing. And so that's understanding that, when we're going to interview these families who have lost loved ones, who have a daughter or a sister or a mother or an aunt who is missing or who's been murdered, that is likely not the only traumatic experience that they've had, that Indigenous people live with trauma, and it's so interwoven in our lives. And we didn't always understand the impact of how telling these really painful, traumatic stories can affect the people that we are interviewing, but also how to best navigate that in those situations. And so it's been a huge learning process for me over the last several years, just understanding the role of trauma and how important it is for journalists to understand the trauma that they're going to be encountering when reporting on Indigenous communities and issues. And I hope that's a conversation that keeps going, because I feel like I've seen firsthand how it can really make a difference in the people that you're interviewing and the stories that you're telling. Whether they're given agency over their own stories, and whether, as a journalist, you see your role as telling their story, or do you see it as helping to amplify them to tell their story? And I think that even those small little things can have such a huge impact.
I want to play a clip because you use a very personal moment to draw the listener in. To set it up, this is from the second season of Missing and Murdered. You're searching for Cleopatra Samagonis Nicotine. Her sister, Christine Cameron, has been trying for years to get information about Cleo. She believes her sister is in Arkansas, but bureaucrats tell her time and time again that they can't share any information with her. Here she is on the phone with a woman from social services. It's yet another frustrating call for Christine. But at the end of the call, something happens.
And then one of my final questions is, have your office had any experience dealing with Arkansas adoption agencies to facilitate the successful transfer of information?
With Arkansas?
Yeah.
I don't recall another instance with Arkansas, no.
Okay.
I'm not sure that information is correct.
Oh, well, how do you know it's correct or not?
Yeah. Pardon?
How would you know it's correct or not?
Because, like I said, we have some of the information from your file.
Well, it would be nice to have some sort of information. You know, as a sibling, you know, it's been 40 years.
Yes.
And for 20 years, you've told me nothing.
I know.
This is my sister. Her body's in the States, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sister?
I do.
Well, then maybe think about how I feel and really try your best. Because if you know she's not in Arkansas, then find a way to tell me where she is.
Okay, that's what I'm going to work on.
Please.
Okay. So I will call you by tomorrow at the latest to let you know where I'm at.
All right.
Okay?
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for calling.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Connie, what's the importance of this moment in your podcast?
Well, I mean, that was an incredible moment for so many reasons. I mean, Christine, you know, she was the instigator of this entire podcast, right? She reached out to us to ask us to help her try to find answers about her sister. All of the Smegness kids were taken from their mother in the 1970s, and all were adopted out into white families and what we now know is the 60s scoop. She and her siblings have been searching for information about Cleo for a long time, and they hit so many brick walls. And, you know, this is such an incredible moment because Christine can tell they have the answers that she's been searching for. This woman that she's on the line with is probably has a file folder in front of her that has the information that Christine needs. And she's just such an incredible woman in so many ways, but just so incredible at really helping to put people in her situation. In the reporting that's been done about Indigenous people and Indigenous issues, when it doesn't go deep enough and when it doesn't explore the context and it doesn't show the full story of what it means to be Indigenous, I think what that can sometimes do is actually contribute to these misunderstandings and to contribute to these stereotypes about Indigenous people. And the podcast allows you to really just pull that apart. And for us, that was a really important moment as well because, you know, we really wanted to see this as Christine's journey and us helping to amplify her to find the answers that she wants, she and her siblings want about their sister, but also about themselves, you know, to understand about what happened to them as children. Why were they taken from their mother in the 1970s? You know, why were they all adopted out and what toll has that taken on each of their lives? And it was really important for us that Christine lead that, and she does it so well.
Now, as somebody who has done this for some time, is true crime podcast something that you listen to and read and watch?
No, not very much. I'll be honest. I'm not a huge fan of typical true crime podcasts. I'll say that because I think that, unfortunately, a lot of true crime podcasts do focus on the violence and on some of those more sensationalized aspects of true crime. And that's not something that I really can't consume violence for entertainment. That's not something that I can do. But there are some really great, you know, ethical true crime podcasts that are fantastic. And I think that genre is just beginning. There's no limit to where that can go. And in the same way that we've tried to do with Missing and Murdered, that there is a way to tell a respectful, ethical, true crime story about a mystery that doesn't forget the humanity and doesn't forget that there are real people at the heart of every story, and that there's a bigger story often to tell about the tragedy they've experienced. That's what's important to me.
For sure. Well, Connie, thank you so much for your time today. We'll keep an ear out for your work in the future.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. I really appreciate it.
Connie Walker is an award-winning Cree journalist and the host of the CBC podcast, Missing and Murdered. Let's see if you can solve the mystery of who my next guest is. He's one of the most respected and well-known authors of our time. He's written nonfiction, novels, children's books, radio, and poetry. And he's won some of the biggest prizes in Canadian literature. He's also very, very funny. Have you guessed who it is yet? Spoiler alert, it's none other than Thomas King. Today I'll be speaking with Thomas about his crime fiction books, The Dreadful Water Mysteries. And at the center of his latest book in the series is a true crime reality TV show. Hello, Thomas.
Hello, hello.
It's me again.
I know. What have I done wrong in my life?
You try to hide, and I'm right there beside you. It's kind of spooky.
I keep looking in the rearview mirror, and there you are.
Well, now that I've introduced you, Thomas, I'm hoping you can introduce us to someone who is Thumps Dreadful Water. Tell me all about him.
Well, as much as I know about old Thumps, he used to be a police officer in Northern California, and there was a particularly horrendous serial killing that killed his girlfriend and her daughter, and after that he sort of walked away from being a cop and just drove his car off into the distance east and wound up in a town called Chinook. And the car broke down, and he wound up staying there. And he's been making his living, as such as it is, as a fine art photographer. But he keeps getting pulled back into mysteries because he's got a buddy who's the sheriff of the town who keeps coming to him for advice. Thumps keeps trying to avoid it, but he keeps getting pulled into these things.
Now, A Matter of Malice is the latest book in the Dreadful Water mystery series. To get our listeners up to speed, this is part of the summary from the book jacket. No spoilers, don't worry. When a local woman from a wealthy family mysteriously dies, the crew of a true crime reality TV show, Malice Aforethought, shows up in Chinook. Trudy Samuel's death was originally ruled accidental, but with ratings in mind, one of the producers, Nina Maslow, wants to prove it was a murder, and she wants Thumps Dreadful Water to help. Thumps is reluctant to get involved until Nina Maslow dies in the exact same place and in the exact same way as Trudy. Ooh, ah, even. So at the center of the, right? That's a review, by the way.
Ooh, ah, yeah.
Ooh and ah.
Yeah.
So at the center of this book is a true crime reality TV show. Where did the idea for this come from?
Well, if you watch TV, which I try not to do too much of, but my partner does, and she likes to watch things like Forensic Files and Trauma in the ER, and she just brutalizes me with these reality shows, and I really quite hate them. I find them just kind of creepy. But nonetheless, when I was looking around for a plot for Dreadful Water, I thought, well, what if one of those shows came to Chinook and began poking around into people's business? Surely something bad could happen with that. And Malice Aforethought, I thought, was a pretty decent title for a show, and who knows, maybe I'll see it on TV.
They'll be like, that's a great idea. Let's make that show.
Exactly.
So watching true crime reality was part of your research?
No, I don't watch true crime reality,
it.
but I hear it from my office when I'm working on my fiction. And when I go out to get a cup of coffee, there it is staring me in the face. and Helen says, you got to see this. And I say, no, I don't.
And yet here you are writing a book about it.
Yeah, here I am writing a book about it. So, I suppose her having those things on from time to time I shouldn't make it seem as though that's all she watches. It's not, but nonetheless, they are on. I see them, and they sort of get stuck to the wall of my mind. And if I can use them, I do. I think writers are like that. We hear something that sounds interesting. We're like a crow, pick up the shiny stuff and take it home with us. I don't play hard and fast off the genre in the novel. It's just something that, is in town. It's a program that's in town, and they go about their business. I hope I don't glorify that kind of journalism, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm hoping we can hear a little bit from the book, if you would.
Sure. I just have to find the book. Thumps has just gotten back from Seattle. He's been there with his lady love, Claire, who had to go there for a cancer treatment. And he's been gone for a while. And so when he comes back, Chinook has changed a little bit, and the Chamber of Commerce has put together what they call a Howdy program. This is to encourage tourism, and they get everybody dressed up like cowboys in this western town. And you're supposed to say things like howdy and yup and partner and yonder and all these little westernisms, yippee, but only if you feel like it.
It's pardner, by the way.
Pardner,
just
sorry,
saying.
pardner. I've got it spelled right in the book. Anyway, so he comes back into town, and he's standing on the street, having had breakfast, looking out at the Howdy campaign. So here is this part. The Chamber of Commerce was serious about its Howdy campaign. Red and yellow geraniums were hanging in baskets from light standards. Horse opera scenes were painted on the windows of storefronts, even the ones that were dark and empty. And the heads of the parking meters had howdy stickers stuck to the front so you couldn't tell how much time you had left. The main street was festooned with banners that announced the Chinook Summer Roundup, whatever that was. Dreadful water! Thumps turned to find Sheriff Duke Hockney at the curb behind the wheel of his black and white Ford Bronco. "'About time you got back." Duke had little concern with fashion. His wife, Marcy, bought most of his clothes, and she generally kept things simple. Long-sleeve shirts in the mid-tone range, dark green whipcord slacks, a comfortable pair of work boots. "You plan to stand there all day?" "I'm relaxing," said Thumps. "This is what happens when you don't have a real job," said Hockney. Today the sheriff was dressed in a multicolored snap-button cowboy shirt, set off with a bolo tie, a leather vest, and an enormous gold belt buckle that said rodeo. Thumps imagined that if Hockney bent over, the buckle would cut him in half. "I have a job," said Thumps. "Photography isn't a job," said Duke. "It's a hobby, like model airplanes and bird watching." The bolo tie with its silver and turquoise slide was somewhat ridiculous. Around Duke's thick neck it looks as though someone had tried to strangle a bear with a piece of dental floss. "Now police work is a real job," said Duke. "And you used to be a cop." Thumps wondered if he could go out to the reservation and camp on Claire's doorstep. Maybe she'd forgotten that he cared about her and needed to be reminded. "Get in," said Hockney. "I got something for you." "In that case," said Thumps, "I'm not getting in." "Damn it, Dreadful Water, I'm trying to do you a favor." The Marshal star on Duke's vest looked like the very thing John Wayne might have worn in Cahill, U.S. Marshal. Thumps wondered what else might be lurking in the sheriff's new wardrobe. Chaps, cowboy boots, spurs. "You know," said Thumps, "I'm enjoying the weather. There's fresh croissants and espresso." Thumps tried to contain his disbelief. How did that happen? Hockney rolled the Bronco forward. "Just get in the damn car."
I was trying to hold in my laughter as you were reading. So the Howdy program transforms the town into this Wild West movie set, complete with cowboys and Indian stereotypes. And you have this amazing way of writing the ridiculous into your stories. And at one point, you're in the book, there's a conversation between two of Thump's friends, Cooley Small Elk and Moses Blood.
Oh, yes.
And they're talking about a new scary show on TV. Cooley says, "In the old days, it was just cowboys and Indians." And Moses replies, "But these days, the cowboys are mostly gone, and we're not as daunting as we used to be."
Yes. I like those two characters.
Yeah. What were you hoping to achieve with the nods to to the old school cowboys and Indians in this book?
Oh, well, I mean, the cowboys and Indians will probably never die as icons. They're just too delicious to throw into the trash can. We don't see many cowboy and Indian movies, but they keep coming back. It's sort of like World War II films. We can't get rid of them somehow. What happens, of course, they get stripped of most of their reality, and they just become kind of imaginary things these days. But there it is. That's what we've got.
Now, final question I have to say, because I need to ask this. I couldn't help but wonder if Thumps is based a little bit on you.
Me?
Yes. Earlier in your book, Thumps heads out and he sets his hat at, quote, a rakish angle.
Oh, yeah.
And in the photo of you, there you are, wearing a black hat, set
with
at a rakish angle.
And what exactly is a rakish angle?
Tilted. It's a fancy way to say tilted.
Well, I did decide early on, I guess, that because as I've gotten older, I've been beset by all sorts of things that you get when you get older. And I thought, why should I leave my main character out of that loop? And so I figured as I get set upon by life and diseases and conditions and bangs and bumps, why not thumps? That's part of living. That's part of being alive, whether or not it's me or whether it's the character. So in a sense, I suppose we are linked at the hip in some ways.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, always a pleasure, and I'll keep a closer eye out for you next time.
That's right. I'll always be in the rear view.
Yeah, I know. I'll just keep having to put my foot on the gas.
I'll try not to take that personally.
I know you won't. You take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thomas King's latest Dreadful Water mystery book is called A Matter of Malice. The next book in his crime fiction series will be out in January. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Zoe Tennant, Kyle Musica, Stephanie Cram, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.